On Wednesday, May 15th, the Karen Reed murder trial continued with day 12 in the prosecution's case in chief. And on this day, the jury actually heard from 7 witnesses. Most of them were lay witnesses, but one was an expert on DNA testing of animals. And I have to say, it was a little bit refreshing to hear some forensics here. Let's get into it. Okay, so to start, we first revisited the testimony of Julianna Nagel, who everyone calls Julie. Her testimony on day 12 was pretty brief. It was just a redirect and a recross to follow up on her testimony from the day before. On redirect, Alan Lally focused on the black blob portion of her testimony, and Julie said that it really wasn't until the next day that she had put 2 and 2 together that black blob may have actually been a person. On cross-examination, however, David Yannetti again hammered on this point. He highlighted that even after she put 2 and 2 together the next day, she never called the police, she never alerted anyone, and seemingly never offered this information when it was still fresh. So is her testimony believable on this whole black blob thing? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Okay, so the next witness was this trial's first expert witness. This was Teri Kuhn of the UC Davis Veterinary Lab's Forensics Unit. Ms. Kuhn is basically a veterinary DNA expert. Her work is all about testing DNA samples and swabs that the lab receives from all over to determine if it has different types of animal DNA in it. And what she explained is that they actually use 2 different kinds of tests, which focus on the 2 different sources of DNA in an animal cell. Those are DNA from the nucleus of a cell and mitochondrial DNA. She went through the veterinary lab's basic standard procedure for testing the samples and swabs that they receive to show that this is a legitimate process where they want to minimize DNA contamination and minimize errors. Anyway, the 2 tests had slightly different focuses. The first one was testing exclusively for canine DNA, and the second one was testing for a number of different animals. This included DNA from dogs, cats, horses, pigs, goats, rabbit, and I think maybe a couple more. And what was interesting is that both tests came back negative for canine DNA, but the second one, oddly enough, came back positive for pig DNA. Of course, in a case where the defense is more or less alleging that police officers are responsible for a police officer death, a lot of people found this to be pretty amusing. But in all seriousness, Ms. Kuhn said that this could in fact be from food, since that is often actually the kind of sample that the veterinary lab tests after all. Now, on cross-examination, defense attorney Alan Jackson focused on the concept of garbage in, garbage out, meaning he didn't go after anything that Ms. Kuhn did, which is smart because she appears to be a very competent expert. Rather, he focused on the standards for collecting the swabs in the first place. And as soon as he went there, who watching this testimony wouldn't be reminded of the red Solo cups from the Canton PD's collection of blood evidence early on in the investigation?
Red Solo cup, I fill you up.
And what came out of this line of questioning is that Ms. Kuhn does an excellent job of testing the DNA. There's nothing to attack there, but she has no control over the collection of the source material, and in fact has no idea how the source material was even collected by the initial entity that sent them to the lab because she's not ever provided that information. But she did agree that evidence logs are very important for giving an idea of who touched what and when. And she agreed that this maintains the specific custody of the evidence so that if it's shown to be contaminated, they can go back and find the source of the contamination. And she also said that plastic containers are not a good idea for DNA collection because they can contaminate the sample.
Red Solo cup, I fill you up.
Now, she also said that there are some materials that can act as DNA inhibitors in the testing. DNA inhibitors are basically things that can interfere with the detection of DNA during this kind of testing. So the DNA might actually be in the sample, but because it came in contact with an inhibitor, the test doesn't necessarily detect the DNA. She said that blood is one inhibitor and garment dye is another. And she testified that she was not told that the sample was taken from a garment that had dye in it. However, I should also point out that she also said that the second test that she did actually also has a test for inhibitors. And Ms. Kuhn said that this test also came back negative for those inhibitors. So in other words, the test looked for inhibitors that would block DNA and didn't find anything that would block it. But Another thing that was pointed out in cross-examination was the fact that different parts of a dog are better or worse sources of DNA. For example, saliva in any animal is a pretty rich DNA source. Dog claws, on the other hand, are not, since they're made largely of keratin, which is essentially dead cells. And finally, one last thing that was drawn out on cross-examination was the fact that dog treats often have pork in them, things like pig ears. And so, at least theoretically, a dog bite could have DNA from a pig if that dog had had treats that had pork in them too. So could this be evidence of a dog that had recently eaten some pig ears, or is that a bit too remote of a possibility here? Would there still be dog DNA in the saliva if the DNA from the pig ears also showed up in it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Okay, so now I want to talk about basically the next three witnesses together because there's just so much overlap in their testimony. These were Ryan Nagel, Heather Maxon, and Richard D'Antonio. If you remember from prior testimony, Julie Nagel said that at one point in the evening of January 28th, or maybe early on in the 29th, her brother was supposed to pick her up, but when he got there, she basically waved him off. That brother was Ryan Nagel, who was the next witness. Well, that evening, Ryan was hanging out with his buddy Richard D'Antonio, who apparently goes by Ricky. And the two of them were also hanging out with Heather Maxon, who at the time was Ryan's girlfriend. So apparently they all got together and went out to McCarthy's bar that evening, and all eventually got into Ricky's pickup truck to take Julie home from 34 Fairview Road. Eventually she came out and invited them in, saying that she didn't want to leave yet. They didn't want to stay, so she ended up just getting a ride from someone else. Now, before this point, all three testified that they basically arrived at the same time as a large black SUV. And when they pulled up next to 34 Fairview Road, they were like a few feet behind this SUV. All of them testified that the SUV seemed to be running since the taillights or brake lights were on. All of them then testified that they didn't see any damage to the back of the SUV. Now, of the three of them, Heather Maxon also testified that while they were waiting for Julie to come outside, she could see inside the SUV and that the dome light was on. And so she said that she could see that there was a woman in the driver's seat and a man in the passenger seat. Then Julie came out and talked to them. Now, Ryan and Ricky also both testified that when Julie did, she opened the passenger side door to talk to them. Interestingly, defense on cross-examination questioned whether the door may have blocked Julie's view of the SUV at that time, and the witnesses more or less agreed. And it appears that when the door was open, the dome light in the pickup truck also went up. Now, this is an important point because if anything is happening outside during that time, it would have been harder to see out there because the light inside the cab is going to be obviously brighter than the light that is outside of the car. Anyway, testimonies varied a little bit as to how long this conversation lasted. It was anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. And honestly, as someone who personally has a little bit of an issue with time blindness, I don't blame them for that lack of precision. But in the meantime, all three basically testified that by the time Julie went back inside, the SUV had creeped forward towards the flagpole/fire hydrant area. And then they testified that Ricky started to slowly drive away to go home. And in the process, all three witnesses said that they could see inside the SUV where they saw a woman in the driver's seat and no one else. So this would suggest a few things. Number one, Julie Nagel appeared to be incorrect on day 11 when she testified on direct examination that when the pickup truck arrived, the SUV was gone. So everything I said about that boxing in the events alleged by the prosecution seems to be out the window. Unless the jury is willing to take Julie's testimony against those of Brian Albert Jr., Ryan Nagel, Heather Maxon, and Ricky D'Antonio, it seems that she was mistaken. And related to that, Julie's brother Ryan did testify on direct examination that when Julie approached the truck, she seemed like she had had a few drinks. Now remember that this was in addition to Julie's testimony on day 11, when she did mention that she had been a little bit intoxicated by the end of the night. Now, Ryan clarified that she wasn't swaying or slurring her speech, but again, this could suggest that her perception or memory or both from that night were not as clear as the prosecution would like the jury to think. Now, another thing that this would suggest is that at some point, the man that Heather Maxon saw in the passenger seat of the SUV moved somehow. All of them testified that they did not see anyone get out of the SUV, nor did they see footprints in the snow. They also seemed to... Oh no, that's a fire alarm.
2,000 years later.
All of them testified that they did not see anyone get out of the SUV, nor did they see any footprints in the snow. It also seems that they weren't really looking for footprints, however, but the more salient part is that no one saw anyone exiting the SUV. At the same time, however, the presence of the pickup truck's dome light could serve as an explanation as to why they wouldn't see something like that. Anyway, on a final note, all of them testified that they didn't see any fast movements of the SUV while they were at 34 Fairview Road. They heard no arguing, no crashing of a car into anything else, and they didn't see it go in reverse at any point. So to me, all of that adds up to the suggestion that this could have been a reasonable time for John O'Keefe to have gotten out of the car and walked into 34 Fairview Road. Otherwise, I have a hard time understanding what the prosecution would be suggesting with the part where the three drove by and only saw Karen in the SUV. At the same time, none of them testified to having seen a man standing outside the SUV, which would have been positioned to be hit by the SUV moments later, perhaps. So in the end, this testimony to me feels like it supports the defense's theory, if anything else. But what do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Let us know in the comments down below. Okay, so that's it for those three. The next witness was Allison McCabe. Basically, the key point in her testimony was that just after midnight on January 29th, 2022, she gave her cousin, Colin Albert, a ride home. When he got in the car, she said that he didn't have any noticeable injuries on him. She said he texted her just before midnight to see if she could give him a ride, and then at 12:10 a.m., she arrived at 34 Fairview Road to pick him up. Now, the prosecution was able to introduce a screenshot that she had apparently taken of their text conversation, which seems to corroborate these times. But there were some potential issues with this. Number one, she had also updated her phone since January 29th, 2022. And no one ever did an extraction of her phone for the actual data that would back up the legitimacy of this conversation or of this screenshot. And so this is basically the only digital evidence that seems to corroborate the times that Allison testified to. But on cross-examination, David Yannetti dug deeper into this screenshot and highlighted some of the potential flaws in relying on it. Most notable is just the lack of metadata to back up whether the information depicted on it was accurate. He pointed out ways that the timestamps of the text messages could be manipulated or how an individual text could be outright deleted. All of this was to suggest that the conversation could have been changed before that screenshot is taken, and we really don't have any way of verifying one way or another at this point. Also, Allison couldn't give a date as to when she took the screenshot in the first place. Considering that she didn't volunteer it until August 2023, there's an open question as to why she felt the need to take the screenshot whenever she did. Now, on redirect, she was allowed to talk about the harassment that the Alberts and McCabes have apparently faced online over this case. And there's some controversy over whether or not that should have been allowed in, but the judge determined that the defense during cross-examination had opened the door to this line of questioning. But anyway, Allison basically indicated how painful it was that her cousin Colin had some really heavy accusations against him. When she expressed this, she broke down on the witness stand, and some people did not think that it was real emotions, but to me, this honestly looked like some sincere emotional outburst, not a dramatization of a fake emotion. And so it may have been that in light of all of this attention by the media and social media, that she wanted to secure some kind of receipt to show otherwise when she turned in her phone for a new one. Or alternatively, maybe this text conversation has been doctored in ways that are important and entirely misleading. Now, before I move on from Allison McCabe, however, I should note another thing that came up on cross-examination, and that is information from the Life 360 app. Now, I'm not familiar with this app, but from what it sounds like, this is a useful tool for parents to essentially track their teenage kids at all hours to basically make sure that they're not up to trouble. And so apparently Allison has the app on her phone, most likely for this purpose. And so Yannetti pulled up data points from the Life 360 that seemingly showed timestamps and locations for her movements in the early morning hours of January 29th, 2022. And those did not seem to really line up with what she had testified about picking Colin up, dropping him off right away, and then going home.
With regard to Life 360, would you agree with me that if you go on that app and you're trying to figure out where somebody in your family is, there's and let's say you want to know if somebody's home. There's like a circle that surrounds your home, correct?
Yes.
So Once you enter that circle, you know that Life 360 gives an alert that said you arrived at home. Even though you're physically not walking in the door, you're within that circle, and that's the home circle, right?
Yes.
On January 29th of 2022, at 12:04 and 53 seconds, you arrived within that home circle, correct?
Correct.
And then at 12:06 and 55 seconds on January 29th, you left that home circle, correct?
Correct.
And then on January 29th of 2022 at 12:23 and 14 seconds, you completed a 7-mile drive where your top speed was 42 miles an hour. Does that make sense?
Correct.
And then you left home on January 29th of 2022 at 12:23 and 14 seconds as well. And what that probably means, reading between the lines, is that you entered that home circle, but then you didn't go home. You went through the home circle and completed a 7-mile drive somewhere, right?
I guess I thought I went home. I'm
Objection, Your Honor.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear your answer.
not. I believe I went home.
Okay.
I was completing my drive at my house.
All right, but at 12:26 a.m. on January 29th, you left home again, right?
Objection, Your Honor.
Did you leave home?
I don't know. I don't remember.
Okay.
All right. And at 12:26 a.m. and 12 seconds, you arrived at the Canton High School, correct?
No.
On January 29th of 2022, at 12:26 and 55 seconds, you completed a 1-mile drive where your top speed was 43 miles per hour, right?
I don't believe so.
And then at 12:26 and 55 seconds on January 29th, you left Canton High School and arrived at home on January 29th of 2022 at 12:29 and 28 seconds, correct?
I do not know.
And then after arriving home again on January 29th of 2022 at 12:29 and 29 seconds, you completed a 12-mile drive on January 29th of 2022 at 12:31 and 22 seconds. Did you not?
No.
And then you left home on January 29th of 2022 at 1:08 and 15 seconds, right?
I don't believe so.
And ultimately, you went through the home bubble and the Canton High School bubble, and you arrived at Canton High School on January 29th of 2022 at 1:28 in the morning and 8 seconds.
Can I see what you're referring to?
Sure. May I approach you, Honor?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Sorry. May I approach?
Yes.
Did that help refresh your memory on where you were that night?
No.
Do you still dispute that you went straight home and didn't leave there?
Objection.
Sustained.
And finally, I had just asked you about arriving at Canton High School on January 29th of 2022 at 1:28 and 8 seconds. You arrived at home, within that home bubble, on January 29th of 2022 at 1:30 in the morning and 26 seconds, correct?
What time did it say I arrived at high school?
1:30 in the morning and 26 seconds.
And what time did it say I arrived at high school?
The high school was 1:28 and 8 seconds.
It wouldn't have taken me 2 minutes to go from the high school to my house. I'm confused.
With regard to the high school was also one of the bubbles, one of the areas where you could be, right, on Life 360?
No.
If I may.
Yes.
Okay. Did you say that on Life 360, the Canton High School is not one of the areas that you're tracked in?
What do you mean?
So do you remember we were talking earlier about?
Oh, like put in a location, like that was
Yeah, so there
home,
were
that was
multiple
high school.
locations, like, if your mother's looking for you, where are you?
Yes.
Well, you're at D&E Pizza, you're at high school, you're at, home, right? I mean, those could be categories.
Correct.
You've agreed that home was one of the categories.
Correct.
And having reviewed that, the Canton High School is also one of the categories, correct?
I believe so.
All right. And on January 29th of 2022, the last entry is that you completed a 12-mile drive on January 29th of 2022 at 1:32 in the morning and 23 seconds. And that's the end of the activity. Do you agree with me that that's when you finally stopped that night?
I don't recall.
Now, I don't know anything about the Life 360 app other than what came up at trial. So I don't know how accurate the app is or the likelihood that it could be pinging locations inaccurately. I'm hoping that either way, a digital forensic expert can testify on this so that the jury and I can figure out how much weight to give the evidence of Allison's alleged movements around then. Anyway, on to the last witness of the day. This was Colin Albert, who of course has been talked about quite a bit throughout this trial. His testimony is important because the defense has suggested that he had something to do with John O'Keefe's death. What exactly that is not yet clear. It's been this big mystery hinted at by the defense for a while now. But hopefully by the end of this testimony, we'll have some clarity on that. Anyway, on day 12, Colin testified that on January 28th, 2022, he went over to his buddy Mike's house after dark. There, he said he had a few beers, and then he eventually made his way around 10:30 or 11 p.m. over to his uncle Brian Albert's house to wish his cousin Brian Jr. a happy birthday. Then he texted his cousin Allison McCabe, or Allie McCabe, to pick him up and take him home. He said that she picked him up at 12:10 a.m., that she drove him home right away, and then he testified that he got home about 5 or 10 minutes later. This would mean that he got home at about 12:15 or 12:20 a.m., but keep in mind that the cross-examinations of Christopher and Julie Albert, Colin's parents, would show that this is basically impossible. Remember that they testify that Colin got home about 10 or 15 minutes after Christopher did. And the video surveillance footage from the waterfall showed that Christopher left the waterfall bar that night at about 12:13 or 12:14 a.m. And Christopher testified that it would have taken him about 5 or 6 minutes to walk home. And then Christopher went upstairs, changed his clothes, and basically got right into bed right away. So all of that math adds up to Colin getting home no earlier than 12:30 a.m., but maybe closer to 12:45 a.m. Now, that's about all we got to see of Colin Albert so far, since the day ended with the end of his direct examination. On day 13, we'll be picking up with his cross-examination, so we will see where this goes. I know a lot of people have been pointing out details about that screenshot of the text messages between Allison and Colin. Honestly, I could go either way on whether or not those were doctored, but I wonder if the defense is going to introduce an expert to talk about how the conversation could potentially be manipulated. And otherwise, I'm just hoping that we finally get to see more forensic evidence here to be able to narrow down some of these other issues. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? What do you make of the witnesses that testified to seeing the SUV at 34 Fairview Road? Does that seem to support the prosecution or the defense in your opinion? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or found it interesting or informative, and if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more coverage of the Karen Read trial, either with our daily recaps or our gavel to gavel live stream coverage from beginning to end, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is out there. See you on day 13.